They just set fire to the theatre. What kind of people set fire to a theatre while a play is still going on? I'll tell you what kind of people. Mad, stupid, angry people, people insane and ugly with rage and illiteracy, and it's not as if it was a little theatre, a small stage that you might consider burning down, but this was the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. How bad must a show be to make you want to burn down the Theatre Royal Drury Lane? Just about make out the orange glow against the night sky. Oh dear God. What have I done? They'll be coming for me now, armed with pitchforks and torches like angry peasants. Well, if the maddened horde are to find me here, they will find me writing, doing that which defines me. I am a poet, and words are my weapons where they only have blunted instruments and sharpened instruments. Doesn't sound like I have the best deal there. Maybe they shouldn't find me writing. Maybe they shouldn't find me at all, or maybe I'll write and they won't find me. Yes. I'll write this note. Gone to the New World. Those papers brought in a small fortune, and the money will pay for my passage. Of course, I spent it all. I'll tell you exactly what happened. You, my imagined audience, give you my full confession as I write it. Look, it wasn't my fault. Well, that isn't entirely true. I suppose you could say that it was entirely my fault, or that perhaps you'll see that though it was entirely my fault, that I was not to blame. I'm not making much sense, am I? I'm gambling, as he would say. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Father. In many ways, it was all his fault. Him and Shakespeare. So, the beginning. It all started the day I was born. I was born William Henry Ireland on the 2nd of August, 1775, almost 20 years ago. I am probably the only person who knows my birthday, certainly he doesn't. Father, he has made it clear that he wished that day had never happened. I was a major disappointment to him, not least because I wasn't my older brother Samuel, whom Father adored and whom he named after himself. I wasn't even second best. Father preferred the family dog to me, whom he also named Samuel after himself. The day my brother died in childhood, I did something so terrible that Father never forgave me for it. I lived and Brother Sam died. I suppose that every day that I'm alive, I'm a reminder that Brother Sam is dead. Father took to calling me Samuel purely to annoy me. He would look at me after calling me Samuel, always challenging me to correct him and always emphasizing the Samuel. Sit up straight, Samuel. Try not to gape so much, Samuel. Have you taken Samuel for a walk yet, Samuel? He called me that name so often that people actually started to call me Samuel Henry Ireland. Even today, people think that's my name. His confession is going to make sure people get my name right. He couldn't stand me. But it was his attitude to Shakespeare that was to be the real problem. You see, Father loved Shakespeare. He collected every edition of every play he could get his hands on, driven to find his works. In our enlightened times, with exciting discoveries being made every day, everyone believes Shakespeare's personal documents will be found. My father believes he is the only man alive who deserves to hold that is the most sacred of things, a document written in the bard's own hand. And yet he doesn't understand those works at all. They may as well have been written in French or even Greek, for all the sense they made to him. Father would go to Shakespeare plays, even hold Shakespeare recitals at our house, and yet he didn't have the faintest idea as to what was going on. As for the sonnets, he was as clueless as the plays. But his love of Shakespeare's works is genuine. And it was that was to cause the real problem. So you see, it was Father's fault and Shakespeare's fault, but not mine. The whole thing really began when my father was taken ill. Now, I am often ill. I am sensitive to the human experience. I pick up emotions easily. Likewise, I pick up physical afflictions. Sometimes I get one from the other. When Lady Mary Suffolk refused to read my ode to Lady Mary Suffolk, I sank into a state of melancholy so profound that for 3 days I lost the ability to blink. My mind is stronger than most, and it can affect my body. I wrote a sonnet cycle about this very thing. It is called, "It is a Wonder I Am Still Alive." It is a wonder I am still alive, for I seem to suffer more than most. It is a wonder I am still alive. For I seem to suffer. 9 syllables, not quite iambic, but it'll do. Anyway, my father took to his bed and told everyone he was dying. Our housekeeper, the repellent Mrs. Freeman, called me to his bedside. "Father, it is I, William." "As if I have not suffered enough. Oh, the light is dying. If only I had managed to find that something in Shakespeare's hand, if only I had managed to find that something with his signature on, then I could go to my Maker in joyous spirit." My father had given his life to the pursuit of Shakespeare's documents, but all in vain. I felt as though life had let him down. In the morning, Mrs. Freeman told me he was still alive, but barely. I made my way to work. Now, my work is pointless. I work at the Inns of Court, where my job is to search through old bills and affidavits for solicitors who can't be bothered with such dull toil themselves. On this particular morning, on examining the papers there, I noticed that many of them were from the late 16th and early 17th century. Rolled parchments, hundreds of the things, all relating to the bill and sale of various goods and chattels to various parties. I noticed, too, that many of the rolls of parchment were blank. And I was struck by a powerful idea. What if I were to write out a bill and sign it as William Shakespeare? And at least my father could die in peace, knowing he had secured that one thing he so wished for in this vale of tears. A signed document in the bard's own hand. I carefully unrolled some parchment. I experimented with diluting the ink so as to make it appear more like the ink from that period. I then wrote down a list of things Shakespeare might have ordered. 10 rolls of parchment, 3 vials of ink, 5 quills. Underneath, I wrote, "Please deliver to," and then signed with my left hand, "William Shakespeare." I rubbed some soot from the fire on the parchment and head off for home, wondering if Father was still alive. He was alive, but even paler, even more ill. This was my chance to do something for him. This was the moment where I would put all right between us in these final few hours. He asked me where I had been. I told him, collecting my thoughts. "How can you collect nothing All I am going to leave behind is you. I am preparing for my final journey. Do not let the surgeons have my body. Do not let them cut me open. Father, I found something at work. Now is not the time for your tales of work, devoid as they always are of any point or interest. Oh, Father, it is. I have something you must see. Something you must see before you... It's a bill of sale. And the signature bears a striking resemblance to... It's very faint. It seems to be that of William Shakespeare. Can it be true? William Shakespeare's signature. It cannot be, and yet it is. William Shakespeare's signature. You tell me how this jewel came to be in your possession, boy. I found it in a box full of such papers. A box full of papers! He snapped bolt upright and grabbed me by the wrist. His grip was fast and strong, and his eyes had the zealot's gleam in them. Now, invention is my first port of call when in the rough seas of the real world. I told my father it was more of a chest, really, and this was just the first paper. What was I doing, making this stuff up? And what was my father doing? Why wasn't he dying anymore? Why did he suddenly look so healthy? Father advanced on me, demanding to know what a chest full of Shakespeare's papers was doing at the Inns of Court. My mouth made its own pronouncement as I backed away. I could only marvel at my own inventiveness. A gentleman came in. He had the chest with him. He asked, "Are you the son of Samuel Ireland?" So the man was looking for me. Now, even though the story was pure invention, I was not happy being removed from the centre of it. After all, this was my tale, not his. No, Father, the man was looking for me. Don't be ridiculous. Why would anyone want anything to do with you? What was his name? I became confused then, as I was 3/4 believing my own tale, yet also knew I was making all of it up. I've lost my thread. What was he talking about? What was whose name? The gentleman! Chatham's Amos, boy, your lack of intelligence blasts out of every orifice. What was the name of the gentleman with the chest? But he was gripping my collar too tightly and I was getting dizzy. When he relaxed his grip, I told him that a mysterious gentleman had deposited the chest at the Inns of Court for safety, and that the contents were to be shown only to my father, and that the man would not give his name as he wished to remain anonymous. I just knew him as Mr. H. I was sworn to secrecy, and the only man who could ever know of the chest's existence was my father, the great Samuel Ireland. I have known all my life that I, Samuel Ireland, was destined for greatness. But of course I knew it was I who was destined for greatness. Now, judging by the way that my father had gripped my collar, he was as strong as ever. But at the time, I was too struck by fear of strangulation to realize the truth. My words I put on paper brought him back from the brink. I decided the best course of action was to keep quiet and to bring my father the supposed documents as and when he asked for them. At first it was easy, just make up some bills. Tax receipts, bills of sale, all stuff of no interest except for that signature at the end. William Shakespeare. Our relationship began to change. He called me idiot less. The fates were to escalate everything. Now, while I was forging meaningless documents, my own writing career was failing to excite London. My collection of poems on the ladies who ignore me was rejected by every literary champion I had sent it to. I even received rejections from those I had not sent it to. 2 would-be patrons wrote to me, begging me not to send my work to them before I had even written to them. Now, Edmund Malone is a literary critic of some renown and our leading expert on Shakespeare. I had sent Mr. Malone my collection, as there was in it a piece dedicated to his daughter Anne, a young lady to whom my heart had softened. I have that piece here. You and I, as part of God's divine plan, should lie together, my sublime Anne. Malone ripped it to pieces before sending it back. His daughter Anne made it clear my attentions were not wanted in a letter she wrote to me. I have that here. Please stop sending letters, as all they do is cause embarrassment and induce a terrible headache. And please stop loitering near our house. Regards, Miss A. Malone. In response, I sent her a 6-sonnet cycle entitled Anne and William, and I was so impressed with this sonnet cycle that I sent it to her father Edmund as a response to his rejection of my earlier work. One morning, Edmund Malone chased me into work, waving my collection at me. In no uncertain terms, he told me to stay away from his daughter, and to never commit another line of mine again to paper. A pompous oath. I couldn't let him speak to me like that. I told him he may be, at present, a well-respected critic, but there's a new generation now. Mine. Why, a poet such as myself, sensitive, yet masterful, young, is the kind of poet someone might entrust Shakespeare's own works to, and indeed, not even might. Yes, I am the one to take up the mantle of protector of English literature. Now, I could tell by Mr. Malone's curious expression that I had perhaps given too much away, but it was to make no difference, as my father was to do much worse. He went and told Mrs. Freeman. Mrs. Freeman. Even as a poet, words fail me when it comes to describing that woman. Mrs. Freeman lives with us, although if you met her, you might think she lived on a blasted heath, was unkempt, and with a set of false dentures made from donkey's teeth that gave her a terrifying smile, and bizarre wigs that had things crawling in them. She's called our housekeeper, but is more like father's common law doxy. In the past, she did offer her favours around town to some well-to-do people to whom she is still well connected. I have no idea who Mr. Freeman was or where he is now, but he is long gone, and who can blame him? My father had told Mrs. Freeman about the papers, and Mrs. Freeman had told none other than her highest lauded gentleman friend, the Prince of Wales, who was in the company of James Boswell at the time. Boswell's literary interest was immediately aroused, and in one afternoon my forging went from being between myself and my father to involving the most important person in the country and one of the most important literary persons. This made discovery of my forging not only certain, but publicly certain, as Boswell and the Prince wanted to come and inspect the papers written in the bard's own hand. Boswell would surely know they were fake. My family would be a laughingstock. Awaiting my father in his study, I slumped against the wall, slid to the floor, and put my head in my hands. Boy, what in the name of God are you doing down there? I almost broke my neck.
Father, it is with great regret and sadness that I inform you that I now wish to die.
Well, don't do it just yet. The Prince is coming with Boswell, so you are needed alive, sadly. I need you to explain the paper's providence. Try and be sociable for once. Try and be like Mrs. Freeman. What, syphilitic and mad? Sociable, boy! And as for those papers, the Prince is to be duly impressed.
Bills written in the bard's own hand are impressive, Father.
Indeed. But is there nothing more creative amongst those papers? This is the Prince of Wales, after all. Is there nothing appertaining to the immortal bard's actual plays, for instance? The tragedies are undoubtedly a touch too gloomy. I am convinced that the melodramatic elements in them were added by witless mummers. Nobody likes an unhappy ending, and I am sure there will be found evidence for Shakespeare's original vision. Now get off the floor. So I returned to the Inns of Court for more ancient parchment, this time with the purpose of putting down some writing that had a little more meaning. I felt as if I'd been handed a commission. Some speeches were easy to amend. Take Hamlet's lengthy speech on death. I always thought it droned on a little long, so I rewrote it. To be or not to be, that is the question. And truly, that is all that needs to be said on the matter. Emboldened by my genius, I set out to rewrite the endings to Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear, making each one end on a happier note. Everyone lived, and no one died. I gave each of the main characters in each play some lines about how difficult it was to get the attentions of young ladies for that. It's proper tragedy. I was improving on Shakespeare, and I was feeling quite pleased with myself when I realized I would never get away with such obvious hoaxing. So, James Boswell accompanied the Prince of Wales to our house, and as Boswell examined the papers, I composed my own obituary in my head. Boswell would surely know. The Prince had come along as a means of absorbing some of the greatness attached to Shakespeare and to stare at Mrs. Freeman's orange-peel décolletage. Boswell was a man of letters, and then Boswell asked my father how he knew the papers were genuine. My father gave his well-reasoned response. Why would Shakespeare sign his name to them were they not? Unbelievably, this seemed to satisfy everyone. They all nodded sagely, and Boswell knelt and wept before the papers before kissing them and declaring them genuine. Boswell there and then convinced the Prince to grant the papers royal patronage and to pay for their publication. I was horrified. It's one thing fooling my father and another fooling the aged Boswell with his shot critical faculties, but publication of my work under the royal seal would attract far too much close scrutiny. I had to stop this gathering snowball. Once they left, I approached my father. Unfortunately, Father, Mr. H. is not too pleased that so many strangers have been granted access to his treasure. Surely Mr. H. will be delighted that the world would at last get to see the Swan of Avon's real writing. And tell him about the money, William. I will give you all payment for publication of the Shakespeare papers, which you must pass on to Mr. H. I do this only for the Warwickshire lad himself, William Shakespeare. Father marched off. I trudged back here to my writer's garret. Knowing that I was going to receive all of the income for the Shakespeare papers, I became furious at myself for trying to swindle my own father. I countered this by arguing it wasn't my father's money, but the Prince of Wales's. I then realized I had made things far worse, as I was sure to end up on the gallows for treason. I tried to talk some sense into myself. Treason? It's prank, Will, nothing more. I don't suppose you've noticed that Father started calling you William. You look exhausted. You should get some rest, or you'll be too tired to write more forgeries for us. What is it that you're working on at the moment, anyway? At the moment, it's Macbeth, but with a happy ending. I thought it already had one. Well, they all die horribly at the end, but now they will live happily ever after. Beth, it's Shakespeare's preferred ending, faithfully restored. When I look back on it now, it was a most remarkable achievement. A sort of feel-good tragedy. So, far from unravelling my twisted ball of deceit, I had enlarged it. Only a madman would believe what I had said, and my father was a madman. And then a few days later, I went back and added something. I told my father that Mr. H. was pleased with us. And not only that, but there was a hitherto undiscovered Shakespeare play which Mr. H would, within the next fortnight, get to me, and we should begin proceedings to get theatres to bid for the rights to put this masterpiece on. What was I thinking? Was I thinking at all? In all honesty, I was so unhappy that I needed to escape into drink, and I needed money to pay for wine and brandy. And every minute that passed brought me a minute closer to being uncovered as a liar and a cheat. Could I not get something out of this sorry mess for myself? Surely I deserve some recognition for my talents as a writer. But now I had to write an entire play. An entire play as written by William Shakespeare. How long did Shakespeare take to write A Midsummer Night's Dream? Or Romeo and Juliet? No one knows. But I can guarantee it wasn't the insane 2-week time span with which I told my father it would take to get the play to us. 2 weeks to write a masterpiece. I spent the first week clinging to the ceiling. I wrote line after line and I tore it all up. Delivery men exhausted themselves bringing wine and sherry to my door. But I realized one thing. I may not be able to write as well as Shakespeare at his best. He had the advantage of maturity over me. But I could most certainly write something that was better than his worst. We were, after all, brothers of the quill. So, for the plot, I did what old Shaky did, and shamelessly stole it from other sources. I wove a tale around the story of Vortigern, the man who would be king of the Britons, and his complicated relationship with the beautiful Rowena, and I named it Vortigern and Rowena. I wrote like a demon, a god of literature, a deity of poetry. I fell asleep at my desk and awoke with a masterpiece stuck to my face in my own drool. My father, meanwhile, had also been busy. The unknown Shakespeare manuscript had been auctioned unseen, and the highest bidder was none other than Richard Brinsley Butler Sheridan, owner of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. For a large sum, all of which was to be paid direct to me, Sheridan would get to stage Vortigern and Rowena at his theatre, and the only contractual obligation on our part was to produce a manuscript for his inspection, but Sheridan had to put the play on. Written like all of the Shakespeare papers on parchment from the period, the ink carefully aged. Vortigern and Rowena could only have been from the late 16th and early 17th century. And there was Shakespeare's signature. It had to be genuine, and indeed, it was genuine. Genuinely by me. At the handover meeting, my father produced the manuscript and held it aloft with pride. Gentlemen, as the swan of Avon wrote, all that glistens is gold. Imagine the confused looks that greeted that. John Kemble, the lauded leading actor of Sheridan's company, read the play aloud. I remembering admiring his gravitas and the way he commanded attention as he entered the room. I also remember the way I started to hate his snide remarks as he turned page after page, appearing to flit between apocalyptic fits of laughter and barely suppressed rage at the work he'd been presented with. Kemble showed Sheridan the manuscript, and Sheridan's face changed colour throughout. By the end, he was a most angry colour indeed. This thing is unfit for any performance. Had this play contained the merest hint of sanity, I would say hang the consequences and be damned. But see, it is too strange to contemplate. Here in the midst of a battle scene, there is a 2-page soliloquy about a character called Anne, a character who we never meet. Have you any idea what this play will do to my reputation? My father's solicitors reminded him it would be considerably less than the damage that they would do to him should he fail to execute his contractual obligations. You promised us a tragedy, and you have delivered a farce. I will present it as such. I will give the world a performance that no one will forget. Edmund Malone, convinced my father was perpetrating literary forgery, had stirred up the literary cognoscenti against the Shakespeare papers and Sheridan, and that ham, John Kemble, had fallen in with him. I drank even more heavily. Around this time, I somewhat inexplicably told my father that there was yet another play waiting in the wings. And within a few hours, he told me that he had secured patronage from none other than the Prince of Wales himself. Oh, God. He was swindling the Prince of Wales again. That's twice the charge of treason. But what could I do? The mighty genie of my imagination had been unstopped. At least I thought things could not possibly get any worse, and then Malone's critique of the papers were published, and things got much worse. Malone's critique was published in pamphlet form and given out free to anyone passing the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. An abridged version was published as a poster and plastered all over London and featured such insights as imbecilic, puerile, and incoherent, and definitely not by Shakespeare. Trying to avoid any controversy, I spent days racing around London trying to tear the posters down, and I attacked the pamphleteers that Malone had hired to hand the things out. Unfortunately, however, I'm a lover, not a fighter. Or I would be a lover if any lady would allow it. And the pamphleteers were of superior size and fighting prowess, so I ended up semi-conscious on the cobbles as a result. In the end, I hired a local criminal to deal with the pamphleteers. He went to Drury Lane with a bear from a bear baiting show in Vauxhall and unchained the animal and set it free, clearing Drury Lane not only of the pamphleteers, but also of the workers, inhabitants, and theatre-goers. Half of London turned against us, while the other half was convinced for the veracity of the papers, and so was for us. By us, I mean my father. Absolutely no one believed I was involved in any way, thinking such things were beyond me. Even Malone thought me a simpleton. He told me so himself one day when he stopped me in Holborn. A poor imbecile should not be caught up in his father's wily counterfeit. If only he knew. If only all of them knew. Especially Gertrude Swain and Lucinda Tyler and Anne Malone and all those other ladies who ignored me. But no one could know. If the prince found out that I was the author of those papers, then my head would have ended up on Traitor's Gate as a result of my body dumped unceremoniously somewhere with the papers protruding from the only natural orifice I had left. So, tonight, Vortigern and Rowena was completely sold out. The atmosphere in the theatre was chaotic, turbulent, with those on both sides, those for and against us, throwing the odd projectile over everyone's head. I went up to the royal circle and found I didn't actually have anyone to sit with. My father had a box, and in it were him, Mrs. Freeman and her teeth, and my father's friends and supporters, so there wasn't actually any room for me. I ended up wandering the royal circle like some kind of hired help. I had to stand at the back of the stalls. My first play, I didn't even have a seat. Restricted view, as well, as there was a pillar in the way. The theatre was filled with loud voices, each proclaiming to have insight into the true nature of the play, while the one man who knew what the play cost in emotional and psychological terms and understood its exact literary worth had to remain silent. Why didn't I have anyone to talk to? Am I destined to be alone forever? Is that the lot of the man who wears the crown of genius? Before the curtain went up, Sheridan came on stage and addressed the crowd. Tonight is a hitherto undiscovered play by William Shakespeare. The crowd went wild. There was roars of applause, jeers of abuse, catcalling. Sheridan let everyone howl for a minute in protest or praise. Or is it? The jeers and cheers that greeted this were deafening. Sheridan hurried off. The curtain began to rise. And strangely and most unexpectedly, a hush descended on the watching audience. I heard my words. My words being spoken. My work was about to unfold. All went well for the first 2 minutes. And then Kemble came on as Vortigern. Vortigern, this warrior king, this charismatic romantic was played by the hopeless Kemble as a complete idiot. Kemble wore a false nose, a long tunic that made his short self even shorter, and ridiculous shoes that made him shuffle as he walked. Kemble played lines that I had shed blood over in such a way as to render those lines daft, imbecilic. Sheridan's company of fools was determined to ruin my play. After a few minutes, I couldn't hear much except for the blood rushing in my own ears, but slowly, as Kemble played each and every line for laughs, I became aware of the audience's reaction. There was laughter, as I said, but also something darker, meaner, and ominous. Low rumble that gave way to a menacing series of boos. Rotten fruit was thrown at Kemble. He picked it up and he threw it back. Bottles were thrown, threats were shouted, a fight broke out near me. Sheridan came on stage and a chair was thrown at him. A man was flung from the balcony. Things quickly took on the appearance of scenes straight out of Bedlam. I saw a man rush to the stage curtains and begin setting fire to them. Smoke started to fill the place as fights carried on all around, and soon above the general noise, one urgent, panicked voice shouted out, "Fire! Fire!" I looked back. The curtains were now fully ablaze. I was pushed along by the crowd of people struggling to escape. Smoke stung my eyes. Was this how I was to die? Struggling as the audience to my greatness fought all around me? There was obviously something fitting about that. I must try and work it into a poem. Darkness threatened to envelop me. I could hear the eulogy for the tragic boy genius being read out over my coffin, and then suddenly I felt cool air all around. I coughed, collapsed and fell to my knees and felt cobbles beneath them. I was alive. Once I had breathed some life back into my lungs, I realized I was indeed alive. But also doomed. Doomed, for there in the crowd outside were the King's Own Guards, very angry Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Edmund Malone and his supporters, my father and his retinue, and a theatre full of smokened, blackened, angry persons. One voice seemed to ring out over the general noise. "Who is going to pay for the destruction of my theatre? Who is going to pay for the destruction of my theatre? Well, that is what you get for trying to slander Shakespeare, sir. Arrest Samuel Ireland! Arrest him and execute him immediately! Enough!" The voice that said this was deep, booming, authoritative. A voice that commanded attention. I was surprised to find that this voice was my own. "Enough! You have indeed been duped, Mr. Sheridan, but only because of your greed, your need to own a supposed Shakespeare play with which to increase your ticket sales. You care not for art. You care only for commerce. You were duped. All of London was duped, as was my father. One man and one man alone was responsible for all of the papers alone. And that man was me. That was me. There, I'd said it. And you know, at that moment, Anne Malone looked at me with something I'd never seen before in a woman's eyes. She looked at me with interest. I'd become a person in her eyes. I was about to go over to her to offer to explain it all in depth when my father's plaintive cry rang out. He's lying, he's an idiot, he can't even write his name in the dirt with his own finger. The play is by William Shakespeare. I have the manuscript written in the bard's own hand to prove it. Oh, hold me, Mrs. Freeman, I am dying. The peace that had held for a minute was now broken. Sheridan rushed at my father, and the guards moved in to stop him, and then the crowd started fighting, and then a bear came rushing in. The recently released bear. And it looked very hungry and angry. The bear caused chaos, distracting everyone, as I watched a man exit Drury Lane, pursued by the bear. I felt a bony hand on my wrist. It was Edmund Malone. And he didn't seem aloof and superior this time, but rather saddened and genuinely anxious for me. William, when these people realize that your confession was real, that they have paid to behold the scribblings of a boy, they are going to lynch you. My advice is to run, boy. Run! But all I could do was stand there with my mouth open, and then Anne Malone's gorgeous voice cried out, "Run, William, run!" She said my name. I looked back. The crowd was hardening into this one mass, one thing. An angry mob. This was no time to face my critics. I started running up towards Covent Garden, back round on myself, running towards Holborn, running in circles, trying to keep my pursuers confused, heading for here. This is where my story ends. I pause now only for history to take note of who I am. Look, I gave them what they wanted. They always want what they have had before. They always want Shakespeare. I am the man who worked as William Shakespeare. I am William Henry Ireland. History will remember me, and my name will be on everyone's lips. And my lips will be on the lips of many beautiful women along the way. Theatre's to the place. I do hope they put it out soon. But I have no money. Nowhere to go.